Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the final PestFacts Essay webinar for the season. This webinar is being delivered as part of GRDC-funded Seasonal Status of Pests and Diseases for Growers project. My name is Maarten van Helden, PestFacts Essay Editor, and I'm hosting the webinar today. The Department of Primary Industries and Regions acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout South Australia and their continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal community and their cultures and to elders both past and present. In today's session, we have two senior entomologists and a grain biosecurity officer who will walk us through the key harvest and storage pests for this season, as well as practical biosecurity consideration on farm. First, we have Dr. Maarten van Helden, who will provide updates on seasonal pest issues observed across South Australia this year. Following that, Nancy Cunningham will discuss storage pests and shares practical management insights. And then Jordan Scott, Biosecurity Officer, will share with us simple ways to improve on-farm biosecurity. We will have time for a Q&A session at the end, so please type your questions in the chat throughout the webinar, and we will address them after the presentation. Now I'll hand it over to Maarten.
So a bit of an overview of what we've seen this year. As usual, it is an unusual year, as we always say. We started off extremely dry, November to April, 6 months with hardly any rain, as everybody still remembers, I presume. And then all of a sudden, when the growing season started, we got a bit of rain, nothing spectacular, but at least enough to get the crops growing. And over the last few months, August to October, there's still a bit of rain, not as much as we would like, but a bit of rain coming in. It's still horribly dry on the northern EP, and it's horribly dry on the eastern side of the state, but the rest of the country has had at least a bit of rain, and I think farmers in the end will be, let's say, relieved after what looked like a disastrous start of the year. Pest observations for this year. So first year where Miriam was really full on in everything that was PestFacts. I think that really paid off because we got a good level of reporting from everybody, farmers, agronomists. So that's really helpful for us because let's face it, we cannot go and run around everywhere to take a look at everything that's around. So we only have a limited amount of field work. And every report that we get in is always useful to get a bit of extra information. And even the absence of pests is sometimes good information. So we started off with this extremely dry summer, which means a reduced early pest risk, and we saw that everywhere. So the normal establishment pests were basically not very present. Some of them, of course, were still present, like slugs, snails, and slugs will not move away, but their numbers clearly had not increased to high numbers. There's a couple of establishment pests that do not reduce when it's very dry because they are over summering either as eggs, like red-legged earthmite and lucent fleas, or as pupae in the ground, like herringbone caterpillars and lotus weevils. So we got a few reports in, but nothing spectacular. There was also good to know that because the aphids were so low in numbers, there was actually hardly any report of virus transmission in canola or in cereals. So I think everybody's happy with that. And then following that very low autumn pest population levels, the build-up in spring was also not very spectacular. So in all, I think we can be quite happy that the pest risk at the start of this year, and globally speaking over most of the year, was very low, with a few exceptions. So spring pest development, we're always waiting for the big outbreaks, and nothing happened basically, except for two pests that did pop up. We got quite a few reports in from cowpea aphids in the southeast, so mainly in pulse crops. Potentially because they've been over summering there in irrigated lucerne areas, so that's a possibility. We have no good visibility on that, but it's something to keep in mind. If there's large areas with irrigation in the area where you're cropping, that potentially can help those pests to over summer, and then they can come to your winter crop when you put the seeds in. And most spectacular this year, native budworm. We've never seen native budworms in these high numbers. It's a very migratory pest, so it moves from inland Australia where it builds up, especially if there's enough rain. As you can see on the top right, there was quite a bit of rain. Then it will migrate when it starts to dry out over there, which it clearly did this year. And then it starts to migrate. So people that are growing pulses are anticipating that, and they usually will look into the monitoring and do a treatment if necessary. But this year we even got reports in from damage in cereals, which is quite unusual. Most likely the moths lay their eggs on weeds, especially on some of the brassica weeds, and then the caterpillars start moving over to the cereals when they don't have enough food on those weeds. Still a pretty new phenomena for us. It's been described in Western Australia a couple of times, so we'll see over the coming years whether that comes back. I hope not, but you never know. If you look at the trapping that we do, so the pheromone trapping for native budworm, it was quite spectacular this year. And it's not just that they arrive, but they arrived several times, basically. There were several waves. If you look on the different images and you look at the dot near Seduna, there's 3 big red dots in that area that occurred in the beginning of August, at the end of August, beginning of September, and then again in October. So very active population of native budworms this year. Usually farmers will know when to spray in their pulses the first time, but in this year they probably had to spray a couple of times in some areas, and unfortunately there's not always enough detail available because those later flights did not happen in all areas, so there was not necessarily another spray to follow up in other areas, but in some areas like around Seduna, I guess the farmers have had to spray a couple of times. We did get some reports in from issues with native budworm that was badly controlled in peas and in beans, probably because, well, first of all, they missed maybe one of those migration periods. And then second of all, if you spray on larger caterpillars, they're already much more difficult to kill with an insecticide. And some of them will be in the pods, in the peas and the beans, where you can't control them because the insecticide doesn't get there. So that gave some worry in some cases. It wasn't disastrous as far as we understood, but still a worrying case. And ideally, the farmer should have sprayed earlier if he would have been aware of the presence of small caterpillars in his crop just before that they became so big and got into the pods. We're now harvesting, or we're close to harvest. We always get those questions in. I can see a pest. Do I need to spray? Don't forget we're close to harvest. So if you think about aphids and viruses, there's actually, even if a virus will be transmitted to a plant now, just before harvest, that will not affect the yield. So that's not a risk, aphids at this time of the year, unless they're really huge numbers in your crop, but you should have sprayed it before. We had those caterpillars, which in some cases, when they missed the spray and they observed some head lopping, farmers are asking, can I still kill them? Potentially you can, but it will be very hard to do because you need large amounts of pesticide. And of course, you need to be very aware of your withholding period. You don't want any residue to be in your harvest. So try to avoid it. And sometimes you just have to accept that you will have a little bit of loss. But it's better to have a bit of loss than to have an issue with residue in your crop. Snails and earwigs and other insects in the harvest is also a question that we get in regularly. Typically, snails are hard to avoid. The best advice we can give for earwigs and snails is to avoid harvesting in the night because that's when they are active and they sometimes go up. And you don't want them there when you're harvesting, when you go through with your harvester. Interesting case is the photo on the right, which we got in from a farmer who said, an agronomist, I think, well, never mind, who was showing us these kind of damages on stems of a cereal. And he wanted to know whether it was earwigs because there was earwigs in the stem. And that would have been a bit unusual. And we asked around a little bit, including at the experts at CSIRO. And we came to the conclusion that this is actually mouse damage. And it corresponded also with the rest of the damage that was seen in the crop, as sometimes on a single plant, several tillers would be dying off early. So clearly mice that have climbed up and started chewing on the stem. And then when there's a nice opening in the stem, an earwig will go in there to hide. So yeah, sometimes you have to be very careful to identify who's the culprit and try to avoid spraying whatever you want against earwigs when it's actually mice that are the problem. So in all, low pressure year, that's good. Some small surprises. I would strongly encourage everybody to keep reporting and yeah, ask yourself whether you have been able to reduce insecticide use, because insecticides are quite important as a cost for the farm. And what we always also suggest to farmers, and unfortunately, I think not many of you do it, but do try to keep some untreated areas when you do your treatment. Except that maybe if your treatment was really necessary, you'll have a bit of loss, but you will also see that in some cases, the untreated area doesn't look different from the treated area, which might help you to question the use of insecticide. And yeah, insecticides, they cost money and they're not necessarily good for you or for the environment. So if you can avoid that, that would be great.
So my name is Nancy Cunningham. For those people who don't know me, I'm a senior entomologist with the entomology group here. I also am the manager for the weight insect and nematode collection, and I've been in that role for the last few years. But today I'm going to talk to you about some of the common stored grain pests that you might see in and around grain storage areas and silos and the like. And we'll start off with some of the most common insects that you'll see are beetles, moths, and book lice. Beetles are probably the majority of the stored product pests that you'll see around your silos and stored grain areas. There's a large number of families in those stored product pests from the beetle section. And they range from the primary pests you get, which directly bore into the grain, to fungal feeders, to scavengers, and some of your accidental beetles who might just be flying in from somewhere and then on their way to somewhere else. There's also moths. There's two particular moths or moth families that are involved as stored product pests, and they're grain moths and flower moths, as well as book lice. Book lice are a little bit more incidental, more on the scavenger side of things. So of those primary beetle pests, you do get things like weevils and grain borers. You can see the pictures here. And the ones that are probably of most concern are what we call first-degree grain insects. So they feed internally in the grain. So as larvae, as the eggs are laid on the outside, and then they bore into the grain as larvae, and then they feed inside the grain, and then they pupate and come out as adults. So they're the ones that tend to do the most damage. And it's things like the maize weevil. Weevils, you can sort of tell that they're weevils by their little elongated snouts that they've got there. A lot of you may have seen the Setophilus. There's lots of different species, but this is one of the major ones, the maize weevil. There's also lesser grain beetle. That's also very common around silos, especially around in Australia. So Rhizopertha dominica is one of the most common ones. And then, of course, there's grain moths. So the difference between beetles and grain moths in this instance is that the beetle adults will often hang around the grain, whereas the grain moths will sort of fly off, and it's really only the larvae that cause extended damage and contamination. We have secondary beetle pests. So these are ones that don't bore into the actual grain itself, but they feed on the outsides and cause contamination issues and just a general mess, especially if they're in large numbers. So rust red flower beetle is probably one of the most common that you'll see around. Tiny little beetles, quite reddish in colour. Tribolium is the genus. You'll see quite a lot of those around, and I've seen those in great numbers in some grain areas. You also get the sawtooth grain beetle, and they can be distinguished by the thorax has this sort of sawtooth mark around it. If you can actually see on the picture there, it's a bit fuzzy, but the thorax itself has this sort of like zigzag on the outside. And then you get the flat grain beetles. So these beetles have a slightly larger head, and the thorax sort of seems to be basically the same size. That's Cryptolestes, and there's a number of species in that genus. So one of the big things is pests of biosecurity concern, and in particular the Capra beetle. I've been involved with some of the Capra beetle programs that have been of concern over the last few years. Trogoderma granarium is its name. It's one of the most destructive pests, grain pests in the world. And the larvae, they can be quite distinguished by their size. They're usually quite long, about 7 millimeters, yellow to reddish brown, and they have they're very hairy. They have long setae and hairs, especially around the rear end. The thing about the larvae is that they can survive very long periods of time. So if you can imagine a container ship full of grain coming from a country that has, has Capra endemic to the region, and they travel from one place to another. They empty the grain, and the container comes to somewhere like Australia. And if there was Capra beetle, it may be in the subsurface of the container, and it can sit there for a long time until there is actually something to eat in the actual container itself. And in the last few years, we've had infestations come out. Generally, and it's not even been grain related, it's been on cardboard and plastics and things like that, but it is definitely a concern. So the adult itself is can be quite different. Like, I mean, this is a range of the adult specimens that we actually have in our collection. You can see they range from yellow to brown in colour. They're generally quite smooth, but you can tell the Capra species by the bands across its back there on the elytra, which are the little wing covers it has. A lot of the native species don't tend to have setae like that. They'll have scales. So just to demonstrate that, the family that Capra beetle in is Domestids, and we have a number of native species in that family. One of them is Anthrenus, and they're the ones A and B there. And you can see, instead of having the setae, they've got this little soft teardrop kind of scale on it. There's also other species which are very similar in the same genus, which is Trogoderma variabile. So if you've worked in and around grain silos, you might have seen these ones. They're very similar in morphology to granarium, but they're a completely different species, and they're invasive, but they're not as destructive. The other kinds of pests that you might see around, which is sort of a bit incidental, are book lice. They can cause a lot of problems when we do get them in larger numbers, particularly if we have moisture or quality issues in the grain. They're quite distinctive looking. They're quite small, only up to 2 millimeters long, soft-bodied. They have very long thread-like antennae, and they're very mobile, so they move very, very quickly across the surface. So they're basically secondary feeders and scavengers. And then we have the moths. So one of the issues with moths is the frass, which is its poop, essentially causing contamination issues within the grain. So some species, the caterpillars will create this webbing, and that's even more of a mess. These silken tubes spun by the larvae inside and gets in amongst the grain. So you get big sort of clumps of grain sticking together because of it. And those can cause issues for machinery and generally retained moisture content too. The grain moth, which is another kind of moth, the difference between them and the flower moths is that they don't have any webbing in their larvae, but they are very destructive to the grain itself. So they'll bore into the grain so it's more of a first degree issue. So it burrows and it pupates in there as well. So you may see the moth around, but it generally doesn't cause any webbing, but it does cause major damage to the grain itself. So control options. I'm probably just going to go briefly over these control options. They are available if you're interested on the PERSA website. Basically, the most effective means for control of stored grain pests is hygiene, and well-managed aeration, cooling, and using the right kind of fumigation for what your setup is. So recommendations are mainly removing any of the grain residues you have around your storage areas and equipment as well. Thoroughly clean any equipment and farm machinery that you have. You could consider commercial treatments, fumigation, phosphine fumigation, and the like. Just beware of, if you are going to use fumigation and commercial treatments, that you are aware of withholding periods for that. And that also is dependent upon how good your ventilation is in your silos. Basically, 2 days after ventilation is complete, it has the withholding period, but if you don't have that system, you're looking up to 5 days for withholding. Install aeration and cooling fans and controllers to reduce the grain temperature helps, because the higher the temperature, the more likely you are to get insects breeding in there. And monitor your silos and your grain storage areas regularly, just so you can keep an eye out. There are a number of means you can do that. There are traps and pheromone traps and the like that you can use to attract some of these store grain pests. For grain stored more for longer than 6 weeks, you should fumigate. And again, the same thing holds up for exposure times. You're looking for 7 to 10 days in a sealed silo, up to 20 days without a recirculation system. And the withholding periods that 2 days or 5 days, depending on your setup. Thank you. So if you want any more information on store grain pests, you can find it through GRDC, through the Plant Health Farm Biosecurity Program, and the South Australian Grains Industry Trust also has a bit of information on their website too.
So I'm just going to have a quick chat about some more, I guess, general biosecurity practices that you guys can implement on farm, and just some of the things that are good to be aware of. So just to introduce myself, I'm Jordan. I'm the Grains Biosecurity Officer for South Australia. And we're part of the Grains Farm Biosecurity Program, which is run by Plant Health Australia, but hosted by all of the local departments of primary industry. There we go. So there are Grains Biosecurity Officers in every mainland state. At the moment, we don't have any in WA just because of recruitment, but every other mainland state, barring the territories, has a Grains Biosecurity Officer. So the main aim of the Grains Farm Biosecurity Program really is to increase the preparedness of the industry, as well as improve biosecurity on farm. And we do that by working with several organisations. So we're hosted by our local departments of primary industry, and we work with Plant Health Australia, and we're funded through Grain Producers Australia to do a lot of education work with farmers, as well as attending field days and helping come up with biosecurity plans on farm and that sort of stuff. I'll give you a few more details later on, but if anyone's interested in me coming out to their farm, or they know someone that might be, we're more than happy to facilitate that sort of thing. So something I always like to talk about in my presentations is the invasion curve, because it's really where we work here in the Department of Primary Industry, especially in biosecurity, is right early on in this invasion curve. So you can sort of see on that graph there where species arrival is. So a lot of what we do is surveillance. So we're looking for a lot of these high priority exotic pests that aren't currently in Australia, and we're trying to make sure that it basically stays that way, that we don't end up with them here. If they do come here, we want to find them as quickly as possible. So we don't have the resources to be everywhere at once, as I think someone else mentioned earlier. So we really do rely on a lot of community science, as well as growers, agronomists, as well as government officers in like national parks and things like that, to be on the lookout for a lot of these high priority pests. Because the earlier we find something, the less costly an eradication containment sort of effort is going to be, sort of across the board. So we really are appreciative of people being, I guess, aware of a lot of these high priority pests and then reporting them to us as quickly as they find them. So some real basics around farm biosecurity that probably a lot of you have heard a lot of times before, but it's always good to go over. The main one really is just to keep it clean, and it sounds simple, but so many people don't do it properly. So it's thinking about things like, if I've just been in my neighbour's paddock and he's got caltrop, I probably don't want to bring that into my paddock. So what should I be doing? We should be doing stuff like checking tires. We should be looking at our boots and making sure we're using foot baths if we're going from into sensitive production areas, because we don't really want to be carrying new weed seeds, pests, insects, that sort of thing from paddock to paddock. So if we can, and I know this isn't always possible in some of the smaller operations, but it is good to have designated areas where you have washdown facilities, and preferably this goes into sort of like a sump or somewhere that's not going to run off into production areas. You can see a bit of an example on the screen there of a washdown bay. So really trying to get rid of any biological matter like plant material, soil, that sort of stuff from around tires and equipment and things like that, because they're really good transmitters of a lot of those pests and diseases. Another one is making sure that when we're disinfecting our boots, we're doing it with a farm sort of agricultural grade disinfectant. You can use bleach and that sort of stuff, or you can go to your ag stores and they'll have quite a few good disinfectants for you to use. But you can see a bit of a example down the bottom there of someone that hasn't washed their boots versus just rinsing them with water versus using a disinfectant, and you can see stuff really sticks around. So your boots can look clean, but unless you're using proper disinfectants, they're not necessarily going to be clean. So it's something to be aware of. Another really simple thing that we found quite effective is these farm biosecurity signs, and we have a bit of mixed feedback, I guess. So some people say they don't work at all. Some people say they work fantastically. We suggest, since they're free to any grain growers across the state, and we will post out for free to any grain growers, just get in contact with your local grains biosecurity officer. If you're in SA, get in touch with me. You can look me up on Google at the Grains Farm Biosecurity Program, and get these up at most of your main gates. And some people say they don't work, and I say, did you put your phone number on it? And a lot of people forget to do that. So make sure you put a phone number on it. Not that this sign does, but and that gives people a chance to get in touch with you. One of the most common ones we have is SA Power Networks. They come onto people's property. They're not always super aware of biosecurity and things like that. So if you know the areas that they're accessing where your power lines are coming through, put a sign up there. And I'm actually in touch with SA Power Networks, and I've had discussions over the past year with them about improving some of the, I guess, awareness around their contractors and around biosecurity and getting in touch with people. And they have said that they're going to talk to their crews about, if they see these specific signs, they're going to really try and endeavour to give people a call. So you can say, stay out of this paddock, go through this gate, so that they're not going through areas that you don't want them to be. Another really basic thing that you can do to really increase or reduce your risk on farm is to know what you have. So get out there, monitor your stored grain more frequently during warmer periods, and know what you're likely to see. So if you know that there's certain insects or pests or diseases that you're seeing season to season, when something new pops up, you're going to be aware of that. And you're going to say, hey, I need to find out what this is. Is this of concern? You chat to your local agronomist, or you can get in touch with us, and we can help you identify what that might be. And that's how we're going to pick up new things as they come in, and it'll also enable you to pick stuff up early on that like invasion curve that we showed earlier. So prevention is always better than eradicating something that's established itself. Once it becomes a problem, if you leave something in there for months and months and months and allow it to breed up, it's going to be a much larger problem than if you catch it early. Another good one that Nancy did touch on during her presentation is try to utilize those less busy periods to do stuff like your checks on your sealed silos, making sure that you're doing those pressure tests, making sure you're cleaning out your silos and putting those sort of treatments in there. Make sure that we don't have that grain residue sitting in there and carrying stuff over from season to season, because you don't want just a little bit of that residue in the bottom and then a few insects in there, and then suddenly your next harvest is infected as well. Now, I've just chucked up the entropy list here. I think it's slightly outdated, but I don't have a good graphic for some of the updated stuff, so we're going to stick with this for now. I've highlighted in red there some of the pests that are relevant to the grains industry. And as you can see, I mean, this is a ranking list, but I think only the top 10 are ranked. If you look at number 32 there, that was something like tomato brown rugose fruit virus, which, as we know, was quite bad, even though it's a bit lower down the list there. So it just sort of shows that anything on this list can be quite a risk to our sort of agriculture and horticulture industries. So good to familiarize yourself with some of these lists, so that if you do see something pop up that you haven't seen before, you can make those connections. I've chucked up here some of our high priority ones in the grains industry. Now, specific identification of this sort of stuff is probably more the other guys' sort of wheelhouse, but I'll touch on a couple of these. Capra beetle is a big one that Nancy chatted about. You might have read recently that we had a detection of those in nappies across supermarkets, and our federal agency is currently chasing that up. So you can see that the sort of, I guess, just how effective these capra beetles are as a hitchhiker pest, because they can survive in just about anything. To my knowledge, I think that was pretty much in a package of nappies, and it was surviving pretty much on cardboard. So they're able to eke out a living on not too much. So that's really good to be aware if you are bringing stuff like shipping containers onto farm, that in those floorboards is a really common spot that you'll see capra beetles. So being really aware that we're not putting our shipping containers or stuff that we're bringing out to our farm near production areas, and making sure that we are checking them, because they're potentially carriers for some of these pests. Some of the surveillance that we do in PIRSA, we actually do surveillance for capra beetles. So we go out to bulk handling facilities, farms, and supermarkets, seed receival sites all over the state, and conduct trapping for capra beetle as area of freedom surveillance to prove that Australia does not have capra beetle established here, and maintain our area of freedom status. We do a bit of phosphine-resistant insect surveillance. We haven't done that in about the last year, but I believe a new GRDC program is coming on board, so I think we'll probably be involved in that. And we do a bit of exotic snail surveillance as well. I'll talk about snails in a sec. Some of our other high priority pests, not necessarily specific to the grains industry, but good to be on the lookout for, because they can be quite general pests. Our number one high priority pest for the country, which is the only pest that's really ahead of capra beetle, is Xylella, and you can see one of its main vectors, glassy wing sharpshooter, there as well. All of these pests have the potential to cause huge amounts of damage, not just out in our primary industries, but also I guess they can be amenity pests as well in our gardens and things like that. South Australia is still currently free from red imported fire ant, but we're just asking people to be on the lookout for that, because obviously there is a population that's under eradication in the northeast of Australia at the moment. And a couple of other ones to be aware of are some of these exotic snails. They seem to be popping up a fair bit recently, so we're just on the lookout, and we're quite aware of the risks that they can pose, especially to the grains industry if they were to establish here. So the chocolate banded snail that you can see up the top right there, a population was found in Wallaroo quite a few years back, but that has since been eradicated, and we're just waiting on detector dogs to run over that site before we can clear that. Lens snail, you might have read it about in some of GPSA's promotional materials, but that population was found sort of in the Port Adelaide area near shipping containers, and that is in the final stages of an eradication program. Green snail is another tricky one. It's established in Western Australia and then parts of Victoria, so we're getting a lot of pressure from both states, and there's a fair few movement restrictions around host produce on that one, but good to be aware of some of these exotic snails if you do see something suspicious pop up. And I'll just end by saying that we are here to support you. So I always say to everyone, if you're not sure who to contact in the government, then the Greens Biosecurity Officer, being myself, is a good place to start. So even if I can't answer your questions, I should be able to get you onto someone who can help you out. But if you do need to report a suspect exotic pest, that hotline on the screen there is available 24 hours a day, so you'll be able to call through and report that to us. Alternatively, you can just email or call me, and I can chat you through it.
In my presentation, even though it was only a single report that we got in, it was quite surprising. I think it was last week that we got a sample in from the mid-north, or a photo, where a farmer had observed quite a lot of tiny small insects in the wheat heads, and they turned out to be thrips. So, which is quite unusual for us to see in high numbers. So if anybody else has seen high amounts of thrips, we certainly would like to hear about that, and even better if we could get a sample sent over so we can actually identify the species of thrips that is there. We have a suspicion, but we can't say that from a photo, of course. That would be great.
It's going to be the final session for the season. Thank you all for taking time to join us, and a special thanks to our presenters for sharing their valuable insights. Before we finish, just a reminder that the PestFacts team, as Maarten mentioned, is always keen to hear from you. Please contact Maarten or myself to report any invertebrates you come across in your crops. We look forward to seeing you next year. Have a great day. Thank you.